So what I'm going to do today is I think that this idea of how the construct of healthy aging is framed is very important. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about the history of how that was developed and what it means and how it's relevant to the issues which we might confront today, whether it be the pandemic or the Royal Commission. And then I'm going to talk a little bit specifically about the decade itself. So first of all, I have to do the transition to getting my slides up on the screen, and hopefully you can see the first slide. So the idea behind the WHO concept of healthy aging started about 5 or 6 years ago, and it's outlined in detail in the World Report on Aging and Health, which was released in 2015. And if you're interested in this topic, it's available on the web. It's been downloaded almost 1 million times, so it's been very influential. And these ideas have also formed the basis for a lot of policy responses globally and entire policy constructs for a number of countries around the world on aging. And the starting point for that, the starting point for the World Report and this model of healthy aging came from the WHO Constitution, which many of you will know says that health is more than the absence of disease. We wanted to take that further and explore it and make it much more concrete. So we started to think about how healthy aging might be more than just the absence of disease. And in doing that, we adopted a framework developed by Amartya Sen, a Nobel Prize winning economist who developed what he called a capabilities model, which is a rights-based model which tries to ensure that people can achieve the things that are important. So through that, rather than focusing on defining healthy aging as being free from whatever conditions are prevalent in older age, we developed this idea that healthy aging was the process of developing and maintaining the functional ability that enables well-being in older age. So what we're trying to look at here is the ability of older people to be and to do the things that they value, whether they can function, not the mechanics of how they function, but whether they can function. And we took that a little bit further, trying to say, well, what are those things that older people want to be and to do? This is the slide I'm going to show you here, I think requires further work. So if you're interested and your researchers, please help develop it further. But we framed it in this way, that we said that every person, regardless of their age, needs their basic needs met. So they need somewhere to live, they need to be safe, they need to have access to healthy food and so on. But then again, everybody, and it's no different when you get older, but everybody at every age wants to be able to learn and to grow, and they also want to be able to make decisions for themselves. They also want to have as much control over their own life as possible and not have other people make those decisions for them. As people age, that can become problematic, and we can explore that a little bit later. But older people also express repeatedly the need to be mobile. Not only do they want to do what they want to do, but they need to get where they need to be to do it. So mobility is important. And as people age, they also express increasingly the importance of relationships. So older people, this is a core ability, is to build and maintain relationships. And the final sort of branch on this tree which we had, and this is one where I think it needs a little bit more work, is we said it was the ability to contribute. Older people need to be able to contribute in different ways. As I've spoken with people since we released the report, I think this could be extended to include people want a sense of purpose in their life, and they want to be acknowledged. They want to be seen as the person they are, recognized. So I think this is a broader field than just contribution, but it gives you the idea of the sorts of things that we're looking to attain. And this tree, I think, is really important because it provides a goal for what policy should be oriented around. What are we trying to achieve when we respond to the report of the Royal Commission? What are we trying to achieve when we move post-pandemic? What are we trying to achieve with all of our individual interventions? And basically, ultimately, we should be trying to help this tree flourish in one of the branches or in the roots. Now, to do that, there's two components of what we call functional ability. One is the individual and all the attributes of the individual which can enable them to be mobile, for example. But the other is the environment that we live in. So, for example, I may have some mobility limitations myself in terms of I may have severe osteoarthritis of the hip or something like that. But if I can have disabled access transport, I can still get where I need to go. So it's the combination of the individual and the environment which actually give us these abilities. So when we think about the individual, though, how might we think about those individual level attributes? We called them in the report, and I should have said the report has formed the basis for the Decade of Healthy Aging, and so has essentially now been endorsed by the governments of the world. So this framing is the central framing of the decade as well as the report. We thought of this these individual level attributes and called them intrinsic capacity. And if you think about your individual level attributes, most of them, not all of them, tend to decline after a peak in midlife. Some attributes like wisdom might actually go the other way, but you know, your locomotor capacity, your cognitive capacity, in general, there tends to be a decline. What this figure shows is it's a very symbolic figure, but it shows each of those red lines is a specific age. So you're getting increasing age as you move to the right of the figure. And what the red line shows is the range of capacity that occurs at different ages in most of the population. And what it tells us is that, yes, we see capacity decline, but as you get older, we also see an increasing diversity of the range of capacity. So in midlife, most people have, you know, pretty reasonable capacity. As you get older, some people retain that capacity and others can experience severe limitations. What we can see is that some people, and this is true even in some of the poorest countries in the world, some people, for example, in their 80s, can retain the capacity of a 20 or 30-year-old. But many people at much earlier ages can have significant declines. And this is really important because one of the challenges as we deal with population aging is we often talk about this idea of an older person. And we often say, you know, 65 and above, and think that everybody who's 65 and above is the same. And this is a very poor starting point if you're going to develop a policy response to population aging, because as you can see, 65 and above is actually an incredibly diverse group. 65 and above, some people have the robust health of a 20-year-old, and other people require very significant care and support. You can also perhaps see, as you look at this figure, that there are three separate groups that capture most of the people in the second half of life. And it's important to understand that because not only does our policy response need to think about this range and this diversity, but it also needs to target people at different stages in these transitions. So, for example, one group up here have very high and stable capacity. They're in quite robust health. Their needs are very different than people who need residential care, for example. Here, the priority is to help people maintain that robust health. This is where the traditional health initiatives of screening for disease and treating it early is important. It's also important for people to maintain their locomotor capacity by physical activity and for people to maintain good cognitive function by staying engaged and so on. Here, the role of the environment in terms of people's ability is often a barrier because the environment is generally constructed for people in midlife. as people move into older age groups, even if they're retaining the same robust health of someone in midlife, they can encounter a number of limitations. For example, issues like mandatory retirement can prevent people from contributing and participating, even though they retain robust health. On the other hand, there may be ageist attitudes in the community which start to see somebody as old, even though they don't feel any different. So these are some of the barriers we need to be thinking about and which we need to break down if we're really going to encourage healthy aging. There's then another group where their health is starting to decline, their capacity is starting to decline. They may be losing some of their locomotor capacity, they may be developing some memory problems and so on. They can still function pretty well, but they have declining capacity and they have very, very different needs than this other group. And so we need to be developing policies that also meet their needs as well as the first groups. For example, here, health systems need to focus on the management of often complex comorbidities that are chronic and continue and will not be cured, but need to be managed over time. The health system has generally been designed to identify acute conditions, cure them, get the person out the door and hope they look after themselves. But as people age, what becomes more prevalent are these chronic conditions which require ongoing management. And we need to redesign health systems to be able to deliver the type of care that those people need. Here, we need to continue to focus on prevention, but the prevention is often not prevention of disease, but the prevention of these functional declines, these declines in capacity. So what we find is that, for example, you can have a number of different conditions at the same time, but if they're effectively managed, you can retain a high intrinsic capacity, and so life is a lot easier than it may otherwise be. This is also where the role of the environment becomes very different, because here the environment can enable you to compensate for or adapt to the losses of capacity that you're experiencing. And one of the initiatives we had at WHO was the Global Network of Age-Friendly Cities, and a lot of the work which that network put in place was about helping people to compensate for or adapt to these losses. And, you know, again, things like disabled access public transport is an obvious example. The final group that fills this chart of the second half of life is a group which have already had significant losses of capacity. And these losses have got to the point where they really need the care and support of others to be able to do the things that they value. And this is where long-term care becomes critically important. And when I talk about long-term care, or when WHO talks about long-term care, we're not just talking about residential care, we're talking about all the care and support which can help these people who have had significant losses do the things that they value, despite those losses. So this is I think is a very useful way of framing how we can target specific interventions with the ultimate goal that I showed before of fostering functional ability. Now, most of this talk, I'm going to keep it a very high level and talk about policy and what we can do at, for example, a government level. But this model is actually also very relevant for clinical practice and for research, and it can be quite technical. And so in my next slide, I'm just going to touch on that. Don't worry, I'm not about to start delving into the details. But this, when we did the World Report, we coined this term intrinsic capacity. We used it to frame policy interventions, and we talked about some of the potential for using it, but we never actually tried to delve into how you might frame it, beyond saying it's all those individual level attributes. So since we released the report, and since I left WHO at UNSW and working with colleagues at WHO, we've been doing research to try and look at how you might frame this idea of intrinsic capacity for the purposes of measurement or for the purposes of clinical practice and research. And this complex picture shows how we're thinking. And essentially, it's divided into two parts, the bits in blue at the top and the bits in green at the bottom. It's much simpler than it looks. At the top, you can see the traditional expressed capacities which we tend to observe in clinical practice or in our own lives. Locomotor capacity, cognitive capacity, vision and hearing, psychological capacity, and then there's a range of others, but those four are really the big four. These are things which we can observe ourselves. You know, I'm finding it harder to get up the stairs, or I can't remember as many things as I used to. But underlying those, and just thinking of those as the key outcome as opposed to disease is quite a radical transformation, because it enables us to start seeing things, the things that occur underneath, in a very different way. And those things that occur underneath are in green. And they start at the bottom with your genetic inheritance. We're all born with a set of genes. But then there's a whole lot of complex biological changes which occur with life, which ultimately lead to these expressions in capacity, which become obvious to us. And there's some incredibly interesting work that's occurring at the moment in the field of geroscience, which is really trying to think about what those biological systems are and what are the changes that are occurring there, and how they ultimately become manifest in these expressed capacities. And there are actually interventions which are now being developed. You'll see those biomolecular systems below. They include your telomere length, changes to your genes through epigenetic changes. There's also one right in the middle called cellular senescence, and I won't go into that, but as cells get older, they also start to function not quite as well, and often they can secrete inflammatory proteins, which can ultimately lead to a whole range of problems, including not just arthritis, but things like heart disease and cognitive decline. So there are some therapies which are now being developed, which target things like cellular senescence, which hopefully will become some interventions which we will be able to apply, which will reduce the declines of the expressed capacities which each of us are aware of. Anyway, I thought I'd give you that slide just so you can understand that the sorts of things I'm trying to frame aren't just relevant for policy, but they can also apply in all these other domains in very, very concrete ways. So let's come to the decade of healthy aging. When we released the World Report on Aging and Health, it was followed up by the Global Strategy and Action Plan on Aging and Health. And in that, the countries which was endorsed by the member states of WHO, it's 194 countries in 2016. And in that, they asked us to develop a proposal for the decade of healthy aging, which has been done. It's based on the work I've just been describing, and it was endorsed in December last year and will run from 2021 to 2030, which, for those of you who are interested in global development, ties in with the last 10 years of the period of the Sustainable Development Goals. So it's trying to position aging as a core part of sustainable development. The decade has 4 key goals, and I hope we'll see how each of those relate to that slide I showed before with the circles, and how each of these things would help a particular circle, or maybe more than one. The first one is it's absolutely fundamental that we change the way we think, feel, and act about aging and older people. One of the core problems, the core challenges, and one of the basis for many of the issues which arise is very pervasive ageism. For some reason, even though all of us are going to get older, none of us like the idea of getting older, and that leads to some very negative attitudes about aging, and it leads to some very negative actions towards older people. And unless we can change that, it's going to be very difficult to change anything else. In fact, what we found in terms of trying to change global policy on aging was, until we started to change people's attitudes to what aging was and what older people were, and get them to understand the diversity I spoke of earlier, and how life is a continuum. There's not one age, one night where you go to bed and the next day you wake up older, and trying to break down this othering where we think that there's us and then there's older people, and trying to understand that we're all in a continuum of life together. Until we did that, it was almost impossible to try and get people to think about addressing the issues of aging differently. So this is the first, and I think the most important and most fundamental goal of the decade. The second is to try to build communities that foster the abilities of people across the life course. And we at WHO in 2011 launched the Global Network of Age-Friendly Cities and Communities. And it's been incredibly successful. And there's over 1,000 cities, ranging from major cities like New York, London, Paris, Tehran, Seoul, through to very little communities in Australia and in Canada, which have really come together within that network to try to identify concrete ways that communities and cities can do that. So I'm very excited and think that that's going to really thrive in this next decade. The third goal is to reframe the way we think about health systems, so that they shift from dealing with each condition in a reactive way independently to trying to think about in a more holistic way about people, and trying to provide them person-centered and integrated care that are responsive to their needs. One of the great areas that has been evolving in the field of medicine over the last few years is the idea of personalized medicine. And I think this is really relevant to people as they get older. As I showed you in that early figure, not only is there an incredible range of capacity at any given age, but then individuals have a whole different array within them of genes and all those underlying biological changes that have occurred with age. Over the next 10 years, I'd like to think that we can start to consider all of those and tailor the specific interventions for individuals so that they're really most appropriate. But most of all, this will require us to think of the person in a holistic way and to monitor how they are progressing in terms of their overall functioning and capacity. And WHO has actually developed a whole program on integrated care of older people called ICOPE, which instead of dealing with an older person when they present with each independent symptom, instead starts from monitoring their capacity, undertakes some screening programs of their capacity, and uses that as the entry point for more integrated care. So I think there's some really interesting models that are evolving, and I think over the next 10 years or so, we will really see some significant advances in that field. But it will require work on this first goal, to reframe the way we think about aging and older people. That has to come first. The final goal, and to me, this is on the one hand the most challenging, but also where there's the most work to be done, is the need to provide long-term care to older people who need it. And again, when I talk about long-term care, I'm not just talking about residential care, I'm talking about all the care and support that may be provided for people as they start to lose the ability to do the things that are important for them. It's easy, and I will just talk a little bit globally here. It's easy here from the bubble of Australia to think that long-term care is available. It certainly may not be perfect and need a lot of improvement, but there are some parts of the world where if you're an older woman and you develop dementia, you can be sent to a witch's camp, or you can be chained to a tree for the rest of your life. That's the reality in many parts of the poorer world. And so when WHO and now the UN talks within the decade of providing access to long-term care, it's not just about, and I'm not denigrating the importance of improving long-term care within Australia, but it's also about how do we put in place the fundamentals in countries that are so poor and where conditions are so terrible. And that requires some really innovative thinking. One breakthrough, I think, is getting people to understand that when you provide long-term care, traditionally economists have framed it as a burden on society. In fact, long-term care not only helps the older person, it creates jobs. It creates a whole care economy if we frame it in the right way. Even in the poorest country, there are young people who may not be able to get jobs, but maybe they can get some work providing care if we can find a way of framing it and finding the financial mechanisms for supporting it. So I think that's an absolutely critical area. And also, I think it's important to think about how we can integrate long-term care with healthcare in much better. There's a clear split between healthcare and long-term care, and that doesn't benefit anybody. So as we talk about this, I'm immediately after this talk, I'm actually moderating a session in the Asia Pacific, which is looking at the post-pandemic world. And I think as we talk about the decade of healthy aging, we need to understand there's also massive global changes which are occurring and which will continue to occur over the next 10 years alongside the decade. And, some of those will be problematic. Some of those actually may be advantageous to moving the decade forward. And I think that there's a saying which I always find useful, which is never waste a good crisis. And I think, if we think about the pandemic at the moment, we can use that to advance some of this thinking on aging, because what's become very evident across the pandemic is just how significantly we have failed to build the systems which I've been describing over the last half an hour or so. We've seen through the pandemic an emergence of stereotyping of older people and othering. We almost see a pitting of generations. This idea that, well, you can't sacrifice the future of the young today just for the old. The pitting of one against the other, and the same with different socio-economic and cultural groups. Poor against rich. We see fighting over access to vaccines and so on. We also saw a very crude risk assessment for COVID, and essentially people said, well, age is the biggest risk factor. I mean, there are many others, but we have this idea that once you get to 65, you're at much more risk, and over 75, much more, and so on. In fact, it's not age. It's those underlying biological changes that I described. And as the earlier figures showed, they're very diverse in how they're expressed at different chronological ages. And so I think the pandemic really brings home how important it is for us to start thinking about how we measure age in a different way than just chronological age. And how we attribute our responses in a different way than just chronological age. If you think back to the earlier figure I showed you with the 3 circles, often instead of targeting those 3 different groups, policy actually comes in at a chronological age. Before that age, you get nothing. After that age, you get everything. And I think that figure really highlights just how flawed that way of thinking is, and it means that some people get what they need, but most people don't. I think that we've seen massive problems in health and social care, and particularly in long-term residential care. And so within Australia, you not only have the Royal Commission, but you also have the pandemic as a stimulus that you actually really need to take action. And finally, what we're seeing now in many countries, but perhaps not as much in Australia as others, is the issue of isolation and loneliness. You know, after a year of lockdown, it's really, people are feeling very isolated. You know, we need to be thinking about how we can put in place systems to deal with that. So I think, if we're not going to let this crisis go to waste, we need to rethink the systems and rebuild societies in a way that actually fosters healthy aging, that is consistent with what I was describing before about the decade of healthy aging. We need, of course, to be better prepared for the next pandemic, and there will be one. But the real risk here is that we move out of the pandemic and think that is the goal, but that's the limit of our focus. Because really what we should be doing is understanding that all the problems which became manifest during the pandemic are reflections on the flaws in society which we can address, so that we can create a society where there's opportunity for all at all ages, greater equity and more sustainability. So how might we align the pandemic, other crises which may emerge over the next 10 years with the decade of healthy aging? What are the concrete things we can do? Well, I think, as I said at the beginning, we really need to rethink aging and combat ageism. There is a global campaign to combat ageism that has been mounted by WHO. There was a report that's just been released which quantifies the impact of ageism on older people. And it also looks to other forms of discrimination like racism and sexism, and the campaigns which have been effective in combating those, to try to put together the pieces of a program that which can really change our thinking on older people. Age-friendly communities, I think that one of the issues which has arisen through the pandemic that we really need to address is this them and us idea and the pushing apart of generations. I think one of the initiatives we often see within the global network of age-friendly cities, which I find really encouraging, are initiatives to support intergenerational cohesion. And I think that needs to be a priority. And then, as I said earlier, I think in reframing health systems, we need to, instead of orient them as they are at the moment around disease, we instead need to be thinking about how we can orient them and fund them in terms of their impact on people's functional ability. That's a pretty radical change. I'm not sure whether it will happen or if it's just a dream, but I think it's a nice goal to have. I think we need to be emphasizing the role of primary care and prevention more, and that means providing services as close as possible to people's homes. And we need to break through this idea of doctors and nurses and develop new careers, clarify responsibilities, and create new career pathways. So, you know, that's pretty challenging because the health system is a fairly rigid institution, but I hope that the decade will provide some sort of stimulus for rethinking the way it's structured and funded. And then finally, and I'll end here, we need to develop real and sustainable systems of long-term care. And, you know, that's not just the poor world. I'm thinking here about Australia, and, you know, Australia has an okay system, but, well, you provide okay aged care, but I wouldn't call it a system. I see, you know, problems in terms of the role of states and the Commonwealth. And often there are financial incentives for cost shifting. You know, there's no real clear responsibility as to how it's all brought together. And to me, there's not a clear vision for how these systems are going to impact on functional ability of people who have significant losses of capacity. I think that would be a really useful start in moving forward within Australia. I think also understanding that long-term care actually creates a care economy, which creates jobs. It's not an economic drain. You know, it's actually probably more productive for society to invest in long-term care than it is in building cars. And yet we're very happy to put enormous tax deductions to try and retain the car industry, or okay, maybe not in Australia anymore, but we are very resistant on providing that to spending that to provide the sort of care that frail older people need. If we're going to do that, we need to completely reframe the career pathways which are currently available for carers. They need to be meaningful, they need to be acknowledged, and they need to be adequately remunerated. And I think for Australia, they're real challenges and need to be a priority. And also within Australia, I don't have the chance to discuss it, but there are a number of countries in the world, for example, Japan, Germany, the Netherlands, which have mandatory long-term care insurance, which provides a sustainable funding pool, which is cohesive and can be targeted in a logical and coherent way towards maintaining functional ability in people as they age, and doing it in an equitable way that supports families and the role of families, but also doesn't prevents them from experiencing undue burden of care, which some families, and often the poorest families, have to face. So I think there's some very concrete things which can be done, and I think that the decade provides the framing for how we can consider specific issues as they arise, and hopefully we will see some concrete policy solutions that arise out of it. So thank you for listening, and I'm looking forward to some questions.